Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. The showdown between Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young still reverberates today. In fact, Sidney's church still exists too. In our next conversation with John Hamer, a historian and 70 in the Community of Christ, we're going to talk more about Sidney Rigdon, his showdown with Brigham, why the First Presidency dissolves in the LDS Church but doesn't in the RLDS Church. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Let's see. So that's very interesting. So let's talk about, this is an LDS podcast.
Yes.
People know how LDS Succession works, but I would like to kind of hit the highlights, especially because, it took 3 years for Brigham Young to go from president of the Quorum of 12 to become prophet.
Right.
1844 is when Joseph died, 1847. Right. And then... So let's do that first,
Sure.
Because what I'm really more interested in is how it works,
of course,
especially with the RLDS Church. Right. But let's do the LDS first, because there was something that happened this past conference that really surprised me, because then I was like, oh, this is like Sidney Rigdon. So for those who aren't familiar with LDS Succession,
right?
Let's talk about how did we go from Joseph's death to Brigham Young to, I think it's John Taylor's next, and Wilford Woodruff,
right.
And then now it's just like...
Now it's automatic.
Everybody knows.
But it wasn't automatic.
When Nelson dies, as long as Oaks is still alive, he's going to be next.
Of course.
So, because it took 3 years for that to happen, and now it's like a week.
Of course, So there was no system. That system was created from scratch based on the personalities at the time. And so... So there's nothing written in the Doctrine and Covenants that says that this happens, that way. It happens because the weight of tradition has made that the source of legitimacy for the LDS Church president. But at the time in Nauvoo, that was not what happened. Brigham Young was, like you say, was not made the new prophet of the church that succeeded Joseph Smith. In fact, like you say, Sidney Rigdon had been angling to be the guardian. So essentially, because the Smith heir was a kid, what you have in a monarchy is you have a regent or a guardian, and so the idea of it is if King Charles died right now and Prince William died right now, then little Prince George would become king, but you would have like a regent, right? Because he's just a little kid.
Right.
And so that's essentially what Sidney's arguing. But what Brigham argues is, the martyrs have just died, the blood of the prophets, all of this has happened. And here we're talking about putting Sidney Rigdon in, as could he replace Joseph Smith? No. You no longer have a prophet in the flesh, but you have apostles. So I want to actually, say we're not going to even have a successor kind of thing. What we'll do is we'll just vote to make the apostles be the first presidency. And that's what happens. And that's why initially the other branches call this group the 12ites, not the Brighamites, because technically, the 12 are now the first presidency. But even though that's what the legal maneuver is, Brigham Young immediately then starts signing his name as acting president of the church. But like you say, it's 3 years, takes 3 years or whatever before he's able to, within now this power group of the 12, some of whom don't stay with him. And so, that he's able to...
Because Emma supported William Marks, right?
So William Marks is the president of the Standing High Council.
Right.
And up until that time, the Standing High Council and the Traveling High Council of the 12 had essentially equal authority under the First Presidency, where the Standing High Council was in charge of everywhere where there's an organized stake, like Nauvoo. Right. There was a bunch of other stakes. And so the stake that existed in New Orleans or something like that would be able to, when they had a problem, they would take that, they would appeal that to the High Council at Nauvoo, which is the Standing High Council.
Because somebody was just asking me, because I said that we don't have a High Council anymore, because it used to be the 12.
That's right.
That were for the missions, basically.
Yeah.
And then the High Council was for where the stakes were organized.
That's right.
And they said, so why don't we have a High Council anymore? And I said, because Brigham didn't like it.
Well, because it had equal authority of him.
Because William Marks was essentially a rival.
Yeah.
And so he had to get rid of it.
Right.
So that kind of I
And
know
this-
that Marx went behind Sidney Rigdon anyway.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the motivation behind why Brigham basically got rid of the High Council,
Right.
was because it basically got rid of the Marx position as a rival. Is that fair to say?
Not only Marx, though, it was the institutional structure that was in charge. So it had been in charge ahead of the 12 before. So by Nauvoo, they had got equal in authority, and the 12 had been rising in ascendance. But there were also 12 high counselors. So anyway, the traveling high council of the 12. But for example, the high council, the standing high council, was actually organized first.
That's what I thought.
And it's in the Missouri, it's the standing high council that is really the governing body of the church. So even when the First Presidency is like wanting to get, they want to get like funds for something, or they want to do something, they go to the standing high council, they put it before the standing high council, the standing high council votes it. So it is in Missouri, it's sort of the governing body of the church, not the 12. And indeed, when people always say, "Oh, Brigham Young, he takes over. He's the one because he should have been the successor because we see how he took over the people once everybody gets arrested and Joseph Smith's in jail, Liberty Jail, and that kind of thing." But what happens is that all the most important people got arrested. That's why Brigham Young is the most important person that didn't get arrested. There's 50 people that get arrested, including most of the people on standing high council. But anyway, or a lot of them anyway. And so what Brigham does actually is he doesn't take over as president of the 12 or the new president of the 12, because actually, Marsh has left and David W. Patton has died. And so now Young is the senior most apostle. He takes over as acting president of the High Council. And so if you go to the Far West High Council minutes, that's where he's the leader. So he doesn't do it by virtue of being president of the 12. It's the High Council that's in charge. So things evolve structurally in Nauvoo. There are cases. So one of my ancestors are Winchesters. Benjamin Winchester is the branch president in Philadelphia, which is like one of the largest organized congregations and things like that. And he absolutely doesn't get along with Brigham Young and the 12, and those kind of things. But because it's not organized as a stake, I think it's like ruled, like they have like a ruling thing that actually the 12 have jurisdiction over what's going on here, whereas the other things that are happening in stakes, the 12 have no jurisdiction. It goes to the standing high council. And so from a position where the high council had been kind of the thing above everything else, actually it's the high council, when Brigham Young takes over is in Missouri, and he's the acting head of the High Council, the Standing High Council, or we can also call it the Presiding High Council. The Presiding High Council, the Presiding High Council is what fills vacancies in the Council of 12.
Right.
So it actually shows that the Traveling High Council is actually subordinate, according to when Brigham Young was acting as the president of the Standing High Council. Anyway, so it's a complicated thing that doesn't exist in the LDS tradition because, like you say, the Standing High Council is essentially absorbed into the 12, or actually what happens is it's completely demoted into stake high councils. And so we get rid of the idea that there is a presiding high council, and we just have a bunch of stake high councils, of which the presider is now the 12.
Is that to essentially demote William Marks? I know Marks
is not part of the church anymore, of the Brigham Church.
Didn't he put his support behind Sidney Rigdon?
Yeah, but then he goes. And then he's no longer part of Brigham Young's church, right?
Right.
So it's not to demote Marx; it's so that there are no institutional rivals. The 12, after Brigham Young makes the 12 into the First Presidency, that makes it so that Sidney Rigdon is now just a counselor to the 12, as opposed to be, and that kind of a thing. And so it's to take control of all those things. Same thing. Another one of the leadership councils that has, potentially equal authority is the presiding bishop that's in charge of all temporalities. And so one of the things that Brigham Young does is make 1,000 bishops. There had only been like 2 or 3 bishops, whatever. There's a very small number of bishops that were a very high-ranking thing. And so that demotes all bishops. Bishops become just like a congregational guy. Bishops are still it's still a pretty big role. We only have, maybe we have 8 bishops in Canada and Community of Christ. And the Bishop of Canada, the presiding bishop for Canada, is one of the main leader directors of Community of Christ in Canada, because he's a financial officer for the church. Same thing, the presiding bishop of Community of Christ is one of the main leadership councils. Stacey Cram, who you mentioned, one of her previous roles was that she was the presiding bishop.
Right.
And at different times in Community of Christ history, the presiding bishopric has actually attempted to take a really, strong leadership role, in opposition to the First Presidency. Richard Howard, who is our first professional historian, essentially our version of Leonard Arrington, he would tell this story about how, this is a New Mormon history, and they're coming up with all these things, and there's things that they're exhibits that they're putting up on the walls of the library and archives, the history department at church headquarters in Independence, and the presiding bishop doesn't like that. They're opposed to these findings, and so he goes to the archives and he says, "Take that off the wall. We're in charge of temporalities. I could, in other words, the bishopric, since this is a physical thing, I could order you to do, those kind of things." So if depending on how you understand what control over property means, you could imagine where the presiding bishopric could really, be a major leadership rival. And so it's demoted in LDS tradition.
And one other story that I remember really well about the RLDS Church was, so Joseph Smith III's son, Frederick, was the next prophet,
yes,
president in the Community of Christ, or RLDS Church.
Yeah.
And then his brother was the presiding bishop. And wasn't it Fred, who was having troubles with the presiding bishop, said, "I'm going to resign if you don't, you have to follow me," and so he basically kicked his brother out of the presiding bishop, right?
Well, no, you've got it, kind of the essentials.
Okay.
Which is to say, there had been balances of power between leadership quorums, and even the Doctrine and Covenants kind of says this. Like the standing High Council has equal authority with the traveling High Council, that has equal authority with the presidents of 70, that,
right,
and the presiding evangelist, patriarch, or whatever. And so there are all of these different.
Everybody's equal.
Yeah, and so
who makes a decision?
Well, and by the way, there's been a lot of fights over that in our LDS history, and so you caught on to one of those. And so one of the things that had happened is that when Frederick Madison Smith becomes the third prophet president of Community of Christ after Joseph Jr., Joseph III, and now Frederick Madison Smith, Joseph III had been prophet for 50 years or something like that. And so he had completely, the imprint of everything in the church had been like that. And so every single one of the people who they just thought of, this is how the church should run. This is what a prophet should be like. And now you have this young guy who comes in. He has a PhD, and so in other words, he's very different from a guy who kind of born in Kirtland and grew up on the farms in Mabu and so forth.
Bill Russell said he was the worst president of the Community of Christ.
Well, so it depends on your perspective, and so from a perspective like Bill Russell, has, and I also am very sympathetic to, of not wanting, church authoritarianism, in other words, to have power concentrated, in one person, then he has a major problem for the church, because he does it. And so he proposes a policy called supreme directional control.
Right.
So supreme directional control of the church is vested in the First Presidency, which is led by him. Yeah. So in other words, we know that in the Brighamite tradition is one man rule or something like that, right? And so
well, that's more of a fundamentalist thing, but
fundamentalists are Brighamites.
Yeah, that's true. So, when I think of Brighamites, I think LDS, but yeah, you're right.
Well, I am inclusive in the Josephite tradition of all of those remnant church and all the other people you talk about. They're all Josephites. We are simply the largest church within the Josephite tradition.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you are the largest church within the Brighamite tradition, and indeed the whole tradition. But the fundamentalists are also Brighamites.
Okay.
So anyway, so supreme directional control. So part of that then is, like you say, his brother Israel A. Smith is in the presiding bishopric, and over this fight, the whole presiding bishopric resigns.
Right. That's what happened. That's right.
And the only way he actually gets it passed through is by, again, using one of the trump
Fred
cards.
Resigns or Israel resigns. So Israel resigned.
Israel resigns, and Fred is able to accomplish it using the prophetic trump card of bringing a revelation, right? And so thus saith the Lord, do what Fred says, and that kind of a thing. And so that is how he's able to make that reform. And the reason why I say that I appreciate Bill's perspective, and I agree that part is a problem. Nevertheless, Frederick Madison Smith, in my view, is also the person who is the second reinventor of the reorganized tradition. So in other words, there's the initial organization under Joseph Smith, there's the reorganization that happens, and then Joseph III is the one that makes that take off, and he is able to take a group that has 600 or 700 people, and at the end of his tenure has whatever it is, 80, 90,000 people, and then from there to 300,000 or whatever. I'm not a numbers guy, but anyway, in other words, there's very big growth, and Fred M., who changes a church that had been based on kind of vernacular subsistence farmers who were going around and clearing land and living in a very, the American frontier and all that kind of thing that had been the church. He is a prophet for a brand new era of America that is making a transition to industrialization as people are moving to, towns like Independence where they're getting, labor jobs and those kind of things. And he is a prophet of the social gospel. And so now what we need to be doing is we need to have a hospital, and so we found, an RLDS hospital, we found, a old folks home, orphanage, all of the other kinds of things that building Zion now is not just going to be about agricultural cooperatives where we're harvesting together and sharing tools and things that people were worried about on the American frontier. Now we're in developing towns, and that created a new momentum. There was another reason to join the RLDS Church, and there is a growth and a change. And indeed, I think what Fred M. Smith created, that's the inheritance the Community of Christ has today, because we have never had, after that, a successful president who has caused growth ever again. So in other words, he's the last person and to have actually energized the church in a new way and has caused new growth and things like that. And subsequently, the church has been rolling on those fumes. And so in that sense, I appreciate that some of the things that he did, he's a jerk and he wants to have all power and all those kind of things. And I agree with Bill Russell. He's got a lot of problems, but in other ways, he's also very successful, and maybe the last really successful in terms of growing a movement kind of prophet in the Community of Christ tradition.
Okay, cool. All right, let's jump back to Brigham.
Yeah.
Okay, so back in Nauvoo, there's kind of the showdown.
Yeah.
Where we've talked about the High Council with William Marks.
Yeah.
William Marks puts his support behind Sidney Rigdon.
Right. So Emma is more or less says, you've been the president of the presiding High Council. The presiding High Council is where we have been approving all of the things like the budget of the church or whatever. You should be the leader. But Marks, I think, very properly says that actually the First Presidency, continues to be the leading council, and there's still a counselor in the First Presidency, Sidney Rigdon, and so Sidney Rigdon has the best claim. And so I think he's right to have said so. But the reality...
let me make sure I'm clear on that, because I think I've heard you say this on other podcasts before, that the most... Because there were lots of people who had claims. The most legitimate claim, according to John Hamer, was Sidney Rigdon as successor. Is that right?
Yes. After Hiram died. After Hiram died,
right.
Yeah. That said, Sidney Rigdon was past his prime. He had a bunch of enemies. There were lots of reasons why.
Heart injury.
Yeah. But the more important in a functional reason why the showdown happened and why he lost is that, one of the things that had happened in the whole lived reality of the movement, once Joseph Smith initiated it, became polygamy. And so because so many people in Nauvoo had been secretly practicing polygamy.
What?
And because it has affected everybody's family structure and life, right? So every single person like Brigham Young who has been doing that, if a anti-polygamist leader like Sidney Rigdon or William Marks, were to suddenly become the president of the church, that has the potential to completely delegitimize everything you've been doing, your entire family structure, all of the beliefs that you might have in sealing and in the eternities and the noble princely households that people are adopted into and sealed. In other words, some of these innovations that have been kind of central to the inner circle of secret practice that Joseph Smith has had, and all that stuff could evaporate. And worse than evaporate, here we are in, this Victorian era. What have you all been doing if these were not marriages? So in other words, there's potential for horrific scandal and for all of this trauma. So those folks are 100% committed to not let that happen. Whereas reformers, the people who were fighting this and saying this is not of God, this is not something we want, they were especially in disarray. So people who are heroes for me in this kind of story, like William Law, great Canadian member of the church, he was out of the church because he had publicly broken with Joseph Smith over this issue. He was
one of the founders of the Expositor, right?
Exactly. And so as a result of that...
Some people in the Brighamite tradition don't like William Law.
I appreciate that, yeah. But I think that one needs to be able to speak truth to power, and when things are happening that are ultimately, in my opinion, abuses of authority, that in this case are done clandestinely, that light needs to be brought to those. And I mean, he tried to get it to stop before he exposed it,
right?
By a lot. He tried to work in the system. But I'll say, look, my great grandparents, Stephen and Nancy Winchester, gave their 15-year-old daughter, Nancy Mariah Winchester, to Joseph Smith to be a plural wife. And we don't know the details, but I presume that he promised that if our families would be sealed together in the eternities, and if we're part of his noble and princely household, that, we know that that's going to get us into the highest place. But that proposal, in my view, is an abuse of Joseph Smith's priesthood authority. And so that's my personal perspective. And so I laud William Law for saying this is not of God, and we shouldn't be doing this, Yeah. And so anyway, the reformers like that are in disarray, right? So he's been kicked out of the church already, and he's, has this thing. And the people who are really ensconced in this are united. And so they're united behind Brigham Young. Brigham Young has the additional advantage of there's all of these English converts that are living in the flats of Nauvoo. So in other words, they've been coming over, poor people have been coming over, and they're trying to live the American dream here in Nauvoo. They can't, if this all ends, they can't go back to to England, They're stuck. They're on, and they know the 12 because the 12 have been in charge of missionary work, because that's what the 12 were for. So they're in charge of that kind of a thing. All of the other people in Nauvoo, when this whole thing goes south, I guess I'm going to go back to Indiana where I was before, In other words, so in other words, the people on the one side of this equation have a lot more skin in the game and a lot less recourse, And so there's reasons why I think, the decks are stacked. But also Sidney Rigdon just ends up being, he just flubs it, so he just has a terrible showing, and he just completely is outmaneuvered, and that's the end of it. So once the 12 are the First Presidency, now the path is on the line. Brigham Young, like you say, 3 years later, he's able to, by hook and by crook, have get a First Presidency organized where he's now the official president of the church, not just acting president of the church. And now the apostles are going to be subordinated to it. It's not clear if there's 15 apostles, at first they're kind of wondering, well, you left the apostles and you went to the First Presidency, maybe you don't get to come back to the 12 afterwards or something.
So
they had to wrangle that.
That Hiram and Sidney were not apostles?
Absolutely, they're not apostles.
Oh. So
the First Presidency in the early church has nothing to do with the apostles at all, any more than the High Council does. And so it's a completely separate quorum. Even the witnesses who picked the first of them.
Is that how it is in Community of Christ?
It's entirely how it is. There is no, it's a completely separate council.
So you've got a First Presidency that's not apostles, although, like Stacy was an apostle, Stacy Cram.
She had been an apostle.
She had been a presiding bishop before that.
She'd also been. You see, people can fill the different roles, but actually, there's only ever been one. There's only ever been one person who went directly from apostle to then being president of the church, which was Steve Veazey. So everybody else has been pulled out of, he gets almost always out of the First Presidency. So Grant had been a counselor in the First Presidency. Israel. I mean, Israel, as you mentioned, had been in the presiding bishopric, but he was
Right.
also in the First Presidency, I think, by the time he succeeded his brother.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
so it's usually the First Presidency is his own thing. It has nothing to do with the Second Presidency, which becomes the apostles.
Okay. Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon kind of excommunicate each other, and then Sidney goes and starts his own church in Pittsburgh, basically.
Yep.
That later becomes, well, he started like 2 or 3 churches, right?
Yeah. Well, that first one, that uncle of mine who I mentioned who hated Brigham Young, who was the branch president in Philadelphia, he becomes one of Rigdon's apostles.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And so then the Bickertonites.
So what happens is that, his first church atomizes.
Yeah.
And my uncle leaves him and goes off and becomes a spiritualist and all this kind of. But anyway, so then the last apostle that in Rigdon's organization that I think he replaces some of these people like Benjamin Winchester who'd left. The last one to be replaced into it, I think, is William Bickerton. And then when the whole church atomizes, Bickerton's kind of left. What happened? Yeah, even
Bickerton left Sidney before because
that's right.
Sidney had wanted to start consecration again.
Yeah.
And William Bickerton was like,
Yeah.
I don't think this is a good idea.
Yeah, he went and did start. He
failed.
did start consecration again, and it failed.
Right.
Yeah, and so what happened was that they still have a Latter-day Saint branches. There are Latter-day Saint branches everywhere, and so actually, I think we talk about this too much, like as if there are completely competing churches at this time. So there's a time in the Middle Ages in Europe when there's like 3 popes.
Right.
So there's a pope in Pisa, there's a pope in Avignon, and there's a pope in Rome. And it doesn't mean that there's 3 Catholic churches. Everybody's still Catholic everywhere. And what happens is that different people are looking to the different headquarters operations, but they're just going about their regular parish business.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point or other, they may recognize the church, the Pope in Rome as the Pope. And then later they might even change, and now the Pope in Avignon is the Pope for them, right? And so I think that that's what's happening. So there are branches all over the place, including Pittsburgh,
right?
And so they've
James
ceased.
Strang up in Wisconsin.
Well, he's the headquarters. So there's a difference between headquarters and branches. So after Sidney Rigdon's headquarters evaporates, there's still a branch in Pittsburgh that William Bickerton is in.
Right.
And he might actually be entertaining when a Strangite missionary has come through with a newspaper from Beaver Island. He may well be getting that newspaper.
And William Bickerton actually did join Brigham Young's church for about 9 months until 1852, when Orson Pratt announced, "Hey, polygamy is a thing. We're official now."
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not even sure that he's
joining.
joining.
I'm out.
Yeah, no, but I'm not even sure that he's joining. To the extent of joining of the church. In other words, Brighamite missionaries come through, and now he's gotten the Bickertonite newspaper, and now they're affiliated with that church. That's what I'm saying. Is in other words, these branches exist all over the place, and at some point or other, like with the last church that they talked to, they're, like this is happening with the Whitmers. At first, like the Strang comes through. Oh, now we're Strangites. Cowdrey gets there. Oh, well, maybe we're not. So I think like that's happening. But like you say, so they are affiliated. That branch, William Bickerton and his branch, are affiliated at a certain point with Brigham Young, which is one of the one of the people that are leading because they're anti-polygamy. And Strang has now come out as a polygamist, so they're not going to be associated with his headquarters anymore. But then Brigham Young says, "Oh yeah, just fooling. We've been polygamists all this time too," and then that causes all the people like that to break with him.
Right.
And so that's what causes him to reorganize his church, and that creates, like you say, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickertonites, and that's why we call them Bickertonites as opposed to Rigdonites, even though they're part of the Rigdonite branch.
Right.
But they're just the only remaining part of the Rigdonite branch, because, like you say, Rigdon then continued to be active, and he started another couple churches.
Right.
But they're extinct.
Right. Right.
So
okay, cool. All right. So the reason the First Presidency dissolves in the LDS Church is basically to excommunicate Sidney Rigdon.
It's to say Sidney Rigdon had no claim.
Right.
So retroactively, every single time the LDS Church, every time the prophet dies, the First Presidency dissolves, which shows that Sidney Rigdon had no claim. In other words, it is a retroactive delegitimizing of Sidney Rigdon's legitimate claim. In other words, but that by doing this thing, we're saying we're trying to make a reality into the past, something that was not true in the past.
Right.
And the same thing is true. The automatic succession of the senior-most apostle, that happens to show what was not true in 1844, that Brigham Young should automatically have succeeded, which he did not. But we're doing it that way in order to retroactively change the past so that it proves a legitimacy now. And then that makes each succeeding LDS president legitimate in that way, and that's why it always continues that way, and it's not a question anymore. But it was completely a question still. Again, it was a question. Are those people that Brigham Young had made counselors, do they get to go back in the 12? Is it going to be the successor? Is it going to be John Taylor, or are we going to pick Joseph F. Smith? There were open questions about how the succession was going to happen.
Okay, so when Brigham Young dies in 1877, do you remember how long roughly between?
It's like another
I think it was 2
years before they're able to get John Taylor is able to, clear out all of the, and he has to do things.
So he's following tradition. He's the president of the Quorum of the 12, and so then he becomes president in, I don't remember what year that was. And then he dies in hiding for polygamy.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember how long
there's another little interregnum there, in other words, because it's not immediately, in other words, it's not automatic yet. But then after that, it really does become automatic.
So Wilford Woodruff, and so it's after Wilford Woodruff, is it
Lorenzo Snow.
That happens faster. So every time
they're also so much older at this point, and they're dying faster as a result of being older, because now
it's aged.
Yeah. But finally, then after he dies, one of the main candidates that was everybody's thinking about if they want to not have it be the senior most guy has been Joseph F. Smith. And so I think once Lorenzo Snow dies, then Joseph F. Smith gets to be the president. And so now it's not a question anymore. And so then at that point it's just automatic.
It becomes automatic. Yeah. And so is it Joseph F. Smith where Snow dies and he becomes prophet pretty quickly?
I think so. I don't know the dates, but I think it happens almost immediately. I think it happens so fast.
Yeah, because they were saying it's hard to run a church without having a trustee in charge. And so then let's just do this fast now instead of waiting all these years. Okay.
Yeah. And so before, there was wrangling and different people in the 12, this is the thing that would happen in the Middle Ages too with popes. Cardinals have like this great power that they get at a certain point. They didn't originally have that, but at a certain point they have this power that they get to be the ones that pick the pope. But once they have a pope, they don't have that power anymore. And so they sometimes would wait 2 or 3 years. They're like, it's kind of nice for us to just run things. Maybe we don't want a pope, And so apostles were kind of feeling that too. If we pick somebody, once Brigham Young was able to do this, he was the guy, and he could tell us anything we want to do. He could remove apostles and all this kind of thing. Do we want to really give somebody that kind of power, And so I think that there were some apostles that kind of rather have it just be, apostles, But anyway, like you say, what happens is over time, now that becomes a firm source of legitimacy. There's no question, like you say, who President Nelson's successor will be.
Next.
And the next person, no one's going to say, who picked him? Why would anybody pick Oakes? He's illegitimate. No, there's no question like that. So in the RLDS tradition, because like we say, we didn't have that history of the 12 and the First Presidency being made the same thing. There are two, actually, so technically three. The way that Joseph III actually became the prophet and president of the RLDS Church is that a conference of the church, the General Conference or World Conference of the Church, actually, voted and made him be that. So the church had been operating and had been reorganized for 7 years before that happened. And so in some sense, it is in fact the World Conference, in the same way we were talking about how the World Conference has legislation. In fact, it's the World Conference that can pick whether anybody could be the president or not. And so technically that would be like one source of legitimacy, but that has been totally subordinated ever since Joseph III became the president. And the qualifications, the sources of legitimacy that he had, that everybody, wanted him to be the prophet and president for, are twofold. One, we talked about, I think already, where we just said, his father had indicated that, that he would be the successor. And because the Doctrine and Covenants doesn't actually have any constitutional things about succession, but it does have this one verse that says, if Joseph Smith shall fall, he shall have no power save it be to appoint another in his stead. That as the governing body of the church, the Doctrine and Covenants is understood to be the constitution of the church. That clause gives legitimacy to the idea that if Joseph Smith picked his son, Joseph III, to be his successor, that is there in the Constitution. And that's what the RLDS Church stood on. Then at the same time, members of the church, including Jason Briggs, who had been the acting president of the church, had revelations of their own, where they decried, right after Brigham Young came out as a polygamist, like you said, where they decried all of these leaders like Brigham Young and James Strang, who'd all come out as polygamists, and said, we refuse to follow any of these factional leaders, and instead we are going to wait for the seed of Joseph, someone in the seed of Joseph, to come forward. There had been
because everybody knew that Joseph Smith III was supposed to be the next prophet, even Brigham Young.
Young.
He was, technically, Brigham Young was just a temporary until Joseph Smith III became old enough, because he was just 11 years old when Joseph died.
Well, that's one of the things that he told people, and that's one of the things that lots of the people would have said at the time, including people like Lyman White, right, who had been present at that blessing, for example, in Liberty Jail. And so that Lyman White was, even though he was a ardent polygamist and committed to that, he always affirmed that the person who'd be the leader of a Whiteite church, but he never claimed to be the prophet and president, because he always was looking for Joseph III to be the successor.
My favorite trivia question is, what was the first first temple after Nauvoo? And nobody ever gets it, but I'm sure you
Zodiac,
will.
Texas, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Although, and I know that I'll get in trouble with anyway. But anyway, although for me, because I have a feeling that because of my ancestors sacrificing as much as they did to build the Kirtland Temple, my belief in temples is that you've got to really go all out to call the building a temple. The church literally bankrupted themselves. They had to flee Ohio, because they did not know. They did not know how to build a building like that. They didn't know how to make a foundation for it, so it was collapsing right from the start. They didn't know how to make bricks. The bricks all fell apart. We did everything. I mean, the story is, the legendary story is the China and everything like that. But the story, whether or not it has any historicity, the truth of the story is that we did sacrifice everything to build that.
For sure.
And that is not true for the building in Zodiac. And so I'm personally, and this is just me. I call that an endowment house.
Yes. Okay.
And by the way, I call about 50 of the LDS temples endowment houses, because those little ones that they made in the 80s that are on those standard plans that have that are made with what I consider to be like a super shopping mall grade marble slapped on the outside and a little Moroni on top. That's an endowment house. I'm sorry. That's my own personal view. So there are magnificent LDS temples. The Washington, D.C. temple is, I think, the most recent one to have been just built as an architectural wonder.
Yeah.
I bet there's so many, and some of the new ones are also attractive. But they're all those are temples. But anyway,
the Hinckley little temples, you call those endowment houses.
I recognize those as endowment houses.
Okay.
So,
all right. We talked about that in a previous one. You'll have to watch that one. But anyway, all right. So I think we've covered LDS succession pretty well.
Yeah.
And so we were
just doing the RLDS. Yeah, the RLDS legitimacy. So I already said the appointment one, right?
Right.
So the other one was that the seed of Joseph, right? So in other words, the royal line of Joseph. So the Book of Mormon says that there's a vision that Joseph of Egypt have of a choice seer descended from Joseph of Egypt, that Joseph, son of a Joseph, would emerge. And in other words, the Smith line is holy, according to the Book of Mormon. And so that was understood in these revelations by that Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley, who had been, both of them, former Strangites. Jason Briggs had been a former Williamite apostle.
William Smith.
Yeah, William Smith apostle.
He started a church. We haven't talked about that one, but that one fizzled pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because he ended up joining the RLDS Church. William did.
Yeah. He did a lot of things.
Yeah.
William
He was a
Smith.
Strangite too, and yeah.
He was a Strangite too, and if Brigham Young would have given him enough money, would have joined. Anyway, a little bit of a gun for hire, that kind of thing. William Smith was a problematic guy.
Yeah,
but yeah, he ended up being in the RLDS Church at the end and was a real full-throated supporter. But yeah, so and by the way, William Smith is the one that put it in all of their heads about the royal line of the Smith family.
Oh,
So William Smith had some great propaganda. So when he made his church was organized in a place called Palestine Grove in I think Lee County, Iowa, which is just like a mile or so away from where, when the railroad came through, a new railroad town of Amboy it was created.
Oh,
And so William Smith's
that's
church.
why you hold all your Whitmer conferences in Amboy every few years. It seems like. Is that why?
But the conference of where the reorganization happened that you talk about, where Joseph Smith and Emma came to the reorganization and he accepted the role as prophet of the church, was in Amboy.
Okay.
And it's no coincidence that it was there, because what had happened was William Smith had been excommunicated from his own church.
Oh.
Because he was secretly practicing polygamy, and he was.
He didn't keep it a secret very well.
No, he was really terrible, and he was, being arrested for statutory rape.
Oh.
And had to flee the state and so forth. And so the RLDS Church, which the nucleus of the Williamite Church, became then the RLDS Church. So one of his apostles, Jason Briggs, was the acting president then of the RLDS Church from 1853 to 1860. So the reason why the RLDS Church did not immediately let William back in is because people knew what he'd done. And they also knew that he was problematic in all kinds of different ways. And so even when he was let back in, he was let back in as a high priest, not as an apostle or as the presiding patriarch of the church. And indeed, then Joseph III waited until he died before they called anybody to be presiding patriarch even. And so we only had our first presiding patriarch in the reorganization only happened after then William's death, and then
because he kept bucking to be
he wanted it bad. Yeah. But anyway, no, but people.
I thought that's why he joined the RLDS Church, was because he became the patriarch, but that's not true.
He joined the Strangite Church because he became the patriarch.
Oh.
Yeah. So
but not with the RLDS Church?
No.
Oh, I thought he was. Okay.
Nope. Okay. So, no, the RLDS people had enough of him in terms of that kind of thing. So, yeah. And so, but when he had that, when he'd had his church before he got in trouble, he published all these pamphlets about why the lineage was the key. The royal seed of the Smith family. And so while we were waiting for Joseph III to get big, who should be president now? Oh, the last Smith brother, William Smith. And he made this great argument from the New Testament, which is who was Jesus's successor? Who was the head of the church in Jerusalem? Who was in charge of the councils that Paul had to appear before to decide whether Gentiles needed to obey Mosaic law in order to be Christian? Who's the successor to Jesus?
Peter.
Wrong.
Oh.
His brother John.
Oh, well.
James, his brother James. His brother James. And so I just said John because I want to be in church. No, it's James.
Well,
so James.
Because I've heard that claim a lot. Of course, the LDS would reject it. We would always say Peter. But
so do
James
Catholics.
was the leader of the early Christian church, right?
Yeah. So Paul, who's our earliest Christian writer who's writing Survive, make it clear that the person who's in charge of the early Christian community is James, and Peter is one of somebody who is in James's community, but it's James who is having the kind of the leadership role in Jerusalem, and so William points that out, and so we have the great Matthean quote, upon this rock I'll build my church, but that kind of, then we might as well all be Catholics, right? So anyway, I'm just saying William makes that argument. He makes a bunch of good arguments. He's a smart guy, and so that really infuses this idea in the early reorganization, which in some ways is the Williamite Church having excommunicated William Smith, that they want to wait for a Smith because they got convinced by William that that's what it should be. And so that is never Joseph III's claim or belief, but that is an RLDS belief.
Right.
And so there's two pillars, therefore, of legitimacy about why Joseph III is the prophet. He has been appointed by the predecessor, and that is enshrined in the Constitution of the Doctrine and Covenants of that happening. You shall have no power save it be to appoint another in his stead.
Okay.
And then he has the royal line as described in the Book of Mormon, and the precedent of James, the brother of Jesus, taking over as William indicated. And so he has the Smith royal line. And so that's what happens going forward. So in the next success, so Joseph III is the prophet of the church for 50 years. But he is very clear. He's prophet, so he can tell what succession is. It's not just, he doesn't have to only do things about what his dad had said. He has a bunch of new revelations, and he has new letters of counsel and instruction to the church about how succession should work. And he makes it very clear that the operative thing is the appointment part, not the Smith lineage part. And so he has a very able first counselor in his first presidency, a guy named R.C. Evans from Toronto, Canada, the greatest orator of the reorganization, perhaps of the restoration. And so I say that because in Toronto, our congregation, we had what we called the theater ministry. And so in the city of Toronto, we had these great old theaters. They were old then, they were new. You could fit 7,000 people, 10,000 people. And of course, they're closed on Sunday. And so our congregation will rent those out, and we have these preaching services, and everyone in the city loves to come and hear R.C. Evans because he's just this amazing preacher. So we fill these things up, 7,000 people and so forth. And so anyway, that really, makes Toronto one of the big centers of, one of the biggest congregations in the reorganization and things like that. And so that talent that R.C. Evans has, causes him he's initially an apostle, and then he's brought into the first presidency. And as Joseph III gets older, he really relies on him. And so they go on a tour of the European church or Britain and things like that. And it's really R.C. Evans who is kind of like the chief deputy. So Joseph III is old, and he'll cut up and say a couple things. And then R.C. Evans immediately takes over and brings the house down kind of.
He's Dieter Uchtdorf.
Yeah. And so he definitely thinks, after this letter of instruction comes out, that the appointment is the key, and you don't have to be a Smith. R.C. Evans is like, okay, I'm going to be the successor. But then over time, Fred M. Smith, who is Joseph III's eldest son, who hasn't really been as actively engaged in church leadership. He's been out getting his PhD in sociology. He starts to be brought into the first presidency. He starts to take on some roles. And at a certain point, Joseph III, it says, he appoints him to be his successor, which makes R.C. Evans super angry. And so eventually he leaves, the church, and he takes, it's after Joseph dies and F.M. Smith becomes the prophet. FM makes a deal with R.C. Evans, which I think was very generous. We'll give you Canada, just don't bug us. And so he creates that position we talked about. You can be the presiding bishop of Canada, and that's why the presiding bishop of Canada is like a special role, up to this day in the RLDS Church. And but R.C. Evans is, got this crazy ego. He's the biggest ego and there's a lot of big egos in the whole restoration, like Brigham Young and things like that.
Because I think Sidney Rigdon had a big ego.
Yeah.
Kind of like Sidney Rigdon a little bit.
Bigger ego than Sidney Rigdon.
Oh, wow.
It's amazing. So we have these, the congregation published these, like this book of his sermons. And then we have the whole book of like his letters and correspondence, all these poems that people wrote in his honor praising him. It was just amazing, the amount of the ego on this guy. Wow. So the church is better off not having had him be the leader, because he was out of control. But what ends up happening is that he continues to criticize, right? So they kind of like be content with Canada, but he can't, and so he feels like he's been slighted a couple times in different ways. So he's critical of Fred M. And eventually they have a showdown at the Toronto congregation.
Supreme directional control.
No, before that, no.
Okay.
No, but so Fred M.
Isn't it the same kind of an idea? I'm in charge.
Well, at this point there is. So R.C. Evans is he's just the Bishop of Canada, and so he's able to. I mean, he's subordinated to the First Presidency, so you don't have to have supreme. So the First Presidency and the Apostles are all the leadership councils. They're on a team with Fred M. against R.C. Evans, who So there doesn't have to. You don't even need supreme directional control for this. But what ends up happening is he comes to the Toronto F.M. Smith comes to the Toronto congregation. R.C. Evans has a big, showdown with him and things like that. Not kicks him out of the church. R.C. Evans takes a third of the members of the congregation with him, and they immediately found their own restoration, new restoration church, which they had to buy a huge church. It was really a big thing. He's a very popular oratory guy and things like that.
Does it have a name? Do you remember?
Church of the Brethren, I think, or something like that. It's something like that. And it's the problem for them is, within just a couple of years, R.C. Evans dies in the Spanish flu pandemic.
Oh.
And so the church continues on for a couple decades. Some of it over time, a lot of people just come back to the RLDS Church or leave altogether. It's a lot of people in the Community of Christ in Canada have connections with that, or a lot of people joined because of R.C. Evans and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So that's one of the interesting histories of my congregation.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, but the whole point of that crazy tangent is that there was no reason to imagine it had to be a Smith. R.C. Evans absolutely was not in a fantasy land to think that he was going to be appointed the successor. So as far as the church leaders are concerned, appointment is what matters. But a lot of members do want Smiths,
okay.
and so F.M. Smith is a very successful president of the church. He modernizes everything. He makes a new program. Almost all.
Is he the one that turns the church more progressive than conservative?
No.
Okay.
No, he's conservative in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
He makes it modern, and not just to say industrial. He creates a bureaucracy. In other words, he creates like the systems. And again, he's the one who tries to make supreme directional control. In other words, he should be at the head of the org chart.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with John Hamer from the Community of Christ. In our next conversation, we're going to dive deeper into RLDS Succession.
With the conference of where the reorganization happened that you talk about, where Joseph Smith and Emma came to the reorganization and he accepted the role as prophet of the church, was in Amboy.
Okay.
And it's no coincidence that it was there, because what had happened was William Smith had been excommunicated from his own church.
Oh.
Because he was secretly practicing polygamy. And he was...
he didn't keep it a secret very well.
No, he was really terrible. And he was, being arrested for statutory rape.
Oh. And
had to flee the state and so forth. And so the RLDS Church, which the nucleus of the Williamite Church, became then the RLDS Church.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.